When I learn of incidents such as the massacre of millions of men, women, and children perpetrated by the Nazis in World War II, how is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? Now, there are some studies in my discipline, social psychology, that seem to provide a clue to this question. The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University.
So Dr. Stanley Milgram proceeded to devise a series of experiments to study the psychology of obedience. Picture this. You see an ad in the newspaper calling for candidates to participate in an experiment on learning. Not on obedience, on learning. So you show up at the Yale University lab, and the stern experimenter wearing a white lab coat explains to you that this is a pioneering study on the effect of punishment on learning.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Learn.
You are assigned the role of teacher. The other candidate is assigned the role of learner. You are to give the learner a list of word pairs to memorize, and to deliver electric shocks of increasing intensity every time he makes a mistake. The learner is strapped into a chair, and an electrode is attached to his wrist. The shock generator has switches, ranging from 15 volts to 450 volts in 15-volt increments. The switches are labeled: slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, danger, severe shock, and XXX. You begin testing the learner, and he makes a mistake, so you give him a slight shock. No big deal. He makes another mistake, and you give him a higher shock. And then he makes another mistake, and you give him an even higher shock, and he grunts.
You'll now get a shock of 75 volts. Soft hair. He kind of did some yelling in there.
And then he makes another mistake, and you increase the voltage. Now he shouts. At 150 volts, he cries out, "Experimenter, get me out of here! I won't be in the experiment anymore! I refuse to go on! Let me out!" You feel extremely stressed and uncomfortable, sweating, nervous laughter. You try to stop, but whenever you try to stop, the experimenter says things like, "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no choice, you must go on." How far would you go, and at what voltage level would you quit? Milgram asked psychiatrists, middle-aged adults, and college students to guess how far would people go, and virtually none of them predicted that anyone would go all the way up to 450 volts. The psychiatrists guessed that maybe 1 out of 1,000 would go all the way. In the actual experiment, do you know what percentage of participants went all the way up to 450 volts? Are you ready? A whopping 65%. And how many went up to 300 volts? 100%. Every single participant gave a 300-volt shock to the helpless learner, despite his protests and against his will and without his consent.
This one will be 195 volts. The correct one.
Let me out of here.
Slow.
Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me
You're
out.
responsible for it. Red. That is incorrect.
Let me out. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Bird,
Let me out.
car, train, plane. This will be at 3:30.
Continue, teacher.
Even Milgram did not expect this result. He was expecting a very low rate of obedience, and then he was planning to replicate this experiment in Germany to see if there are cultural differences. So instead of going to Germany, he decided to run the experiment again, but this time the learner mentioned in front of the experimenter that he has a heart condition. Now with that in mind, what percentage of people do you think went all the way to 450 volts? Surely no one is going to deliver a 450 volt shock to a guy with a heart condition, right? Wrong. 63% did. Let that sink in for a second. 63% of participants gave a 450 volt shock to the learner who has a heart condition, who was screaming, "Let me out of here! Let me out of here! My heart's bothering me! I refuse to go on! You have no right to keep me here! Let me out! Let me out!" Ladies and gentlemen, this is disturbing. And you have to understand that these participants were just normal people like you and me. These weren't psychopaths, criminals, mobsters, or gangsters, or serial killers. No, they're just normal people.
I can't stand the pain. Let me out of here.
Can't stand it. I'm not going to kill that man, eh?
Continue, please.
All right, next one, slow. Walk, dance, truck, music. 375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering a less voltage. Can't you check in and see if he's all right, please?
Milgram's findings horrified America. They showed that decent American citizens were as capable of committing acts against their conscience as the Germans had been under the Nazis.
You see, when monsters do monstrous things, we can at least be comforted by the fact that there aren't too many monsters in the world. They are the exception. But when normal people are capable of monstrosity, when ordered by an authority figure, that is a very scary thought. Now, if it's any comfort to you, I have to say that no human beings were hurt in this experiment. The learner was actually the experimenter's confederate, his accomplice. He was an actor, and he wasn't really getting shocked. They were tricking the candidate. But some critics argued that the participants might have been hurt because their self-concept may have been altered. After the experiment, they probably thought, man, I'm a horrible human being. How the hell did I do that? I never knew I was capable of hurting another human like that. One participant's wife even told him,
"You can call yourself Eichmann,"
referring to Adolf Eichmann, the administrator of the Nazi death camps. Now let's look at the factors that impact obedience. The experiment was repeated with different variations to tease out these factors. The victim's distance impacts obedience. If the victim is remote and the teachers heard no complaints, nearly 100% calmly obeyed all the way to the end. If they were behind a wall and the teachers can hear the complaints, then full obedience is around 65%, as mentioned before, the original version of the experiment. If the teacher and the learner are in the same room, then full obedience drops to 40%. And if the teacher is required to force the learner's hand onto a shock plate to deliver the shock, then full obedience drops to 30%, which is still insanely high. Like, the guy is complaining and he doesn't want to be here anymore and he doesn't want to get shocked, and still you're grabbing his hand and forcing it on a plate? This is absolutely insane. You would notice that in a war, it is easy for a soldier to bomb a helpless village from the sky, but much more difficult to kill a helpless villager face to face. Indeed, some soldiers report that when they are up close with the enemy, some of them refuse to shoot, or they miss on purpose, because they can't bring themselves to kill another human being up close. The Nazis ultimately used concrete gas chambers to kill their victims without hearing or seeing them directly, which made it easier to obey those lethal orders. The authority figure giving the orders must be perceived as legitimate. In one variation, a clerk, another actor, rather than the scientist in the lab coat, gave the participants the instructions to escalate the shocks, and only 20% obeyed him. He acted like he was disgusted with their defiance and took matters into his own hand. He sat down at the generator and he started delivering the shocks himself. Most of the defiant participants tried to stop him. Some of them even tried to unplug the shock generator. One large guy lifted the clerk from his chair and threw him across the room. But when the authority figure was the scientist in the lab coat, they were much more polite and obedient. The physical closeness of the authority affects obedience. When the experimenter was there in the room, the obedience was at its highest. When he was giving commands over the phone, obedience dropped to 21%, although many lied and said they were obeying. If the experimenter was not there and the learner had to get the instructions from a tape recorder, obedience dropped even further. So if you want people to obey you, be up close in their face.
Drop and give me push-ups!
As mentioned, the experiment was conducted in the very prestigious Yale University, which had an impact on obedience. However, when the experiment was repeated in a building in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and said to be sponsored by a private commercial research firm, obedience dropped to 48%, which is still very high. In one version of the experiment, the teacher was placed with two other participants, actors, who defied the experimenter. This led to 90% of the teachers to also defy him. So be that guy. Be the guy who stands up against evil, and other people would follow you. Another factor was the gradual nature of the shocks. So at first, you deliver 15 volts, which is nothing, then 30 volts, still okay, then 45 volts, then 60. Every step you take, you are becoming more and more committed to the experiment. Then you deliver 75 volts. Hey, I already gave him 60 volts. 75 is not much higher, really. And then you give 90. 90 is almost like 75. And then 90, 105, it's almost the same. All right, I'll give 105. And it just keeps escalating. Such are the footsteps of the devil, so to speak. Look at your own life. If you've ever done something terrible, chances are you didn't do it straight away. It probably escalated gradually, so be careful. I would like to point out that in the original experiments, all the candidates were male. What if the teachers were female? What if the learners were female? How would that impact obedience? Let me know in the comments section below and tell me why. Also, if you were a participant in the original experiment, how obedient do you think you would have been? Comment below, and see you next time. And an electrode is attached to his wrist. Then make a sound. Do it again. Make a sound like this. But some critics argued the original version. Original virgin? Original version. What's wrong with me? Virgin?